When I reflect upon Elsa's fear of her own abilities, I recognize a fundamental mechanism of the psyche. Repression emerges not because something is objectively dangerous, but because the individual believes that the emotion connected to it threatens their internal stability. Elsa does not fear the destruction her powers might cause. Rather, she fears what those powers reveal about her innermost emotional life. Her gift is inseparable from her affect, and therefore the instinctive reaction is to bury both. This is the foundation of repression, the banishment of feeling to avoid confronting the terror of one's own intensity. From childhood, Elsa internalizes the idea that her emotions are uncontrollable forces that could harm those she loves. This belief does not arise naturally, it is imposed by the panic surrounding her. So she learns that the emergence of feeling is synonymous with catastrophe. In such conditions, the mind builds defenses. Instead of exploring or understanding her emotions, Elsa distances herself from them. And as the years pass, this distancing becomes automatic, an unconscious operation that keeps her inner world frozen to prevent any possibility of danger. Her fear is amplified by the moral weight attached to her powers. She interprets the accidental injury of her sister not as an unfortunate event, but as a personal failure rooted in her own emotional inadequacy. This guilt transforms her power into a forbidden territory. For Elsa, the self becomes something that must be controlled, hidden, and ultimately silenced. The repression does not simply target her abilities, it targets the emotional core from which those abilities spring. It is the emotion she fears, not the ice. Such repression, however, does not eliminate the affect. It merely forces it into the unconscious, where it continues to exert pressure. In Elsa's case, every moment of anxiety, every attempt to suppress her feelings, tightens the internal knot. The more she tries to conceal, the more volatile her powers become. This dynamic reveals an essential truth of the psyche. What is repressed does not disappear. It returns with greater force, often in symbolic or uncontrolled forms. Her icy outbursts are not acts of aggression. They are the psyche's attempts to express what she has forbidden herself to feel. In this way, Elsa becomes both the jailer and the prisoner. She constructs a rigid internal system where emotion is equated with guilt and guilt with danger. The phrase, "conceal, don't feel," becomes a commandment she directs toward herself with the severity of a tyrannical superego. A harsh internal voice develops, telling her that safety depends on emotional silence. And as this voice grows stronger, her true self retreats further, frozen beneath layers of fear and self-surveillance. Yet even as she represses her emotions, Elsa experiences an unconscious longing for expression. The self desires coherence, it seeks integration. Part of her yearns for freedom, not merely from responsibility, but from the crushing weight of emotional prohibition. This tension between suppression and expression creates an inner conflict that becomes increasingly untenable. The icy bursts that frighten her are manifestations of this conflict, the unconscious forcing its way into consciousness when repression falters. It becomes clear then that Elsa's fear of her power is a fear of confronting the emotional truth buried beneath years of suppression. She has come to believe that feeling deeply will cause harm, that vulnerability is synonymous with danger. This belief, once internalized, shapes her identity. She withdraws, isolates herself, and constructs a life devoid of emotional intimacy. The repression becomes a lifestyle, a way of surviving the unbearable responsibility she associates with her inner world. Thus, I conclude that Elsa embodies the archetype of repression not because she wishes to escape others, but because she wishes to escape the frightening depth of her own emotional life. Her power is merely the symbol. The true danger, in her eyes, lies within. Until she confronts that inner fear, the ice will continue to reflect the emotional landscape she has worked so hard to hide. The repression is not her protection, it is her prison. I regard Elsa's locked room as one regards a mind that barricades itself against its own inner storms. When a person fears their emotions, they are not towing the world, they are escaping from themselves. Inside this retreat, the room becomes a symbolic vault where every forbidden impulse is pushed away from consciousness, as if the door could contain something that continues to pulse behind the walls. I have watched many patients create such an inner refuge, convinced that solitude protects them. Yet the very act of hiding intensifies what is repressed, making it denser, heavier, more urgent. Elsa does not see that her isolation is the perfect architecture of repression. Every locked door is a confession of fear, and every silence is an emotion begging to be seen. When I consider Elsa sealing herself inside, I recognize the same mechanism I observed in adults who, since childhood, learned to silence feelings they considered dangerous. The room is never merely a room. It is the unconscious reorganized into walls and shadows. There, everything she fears remains active, waiting for a breach through which it might surface. Repression destroys nothing. It merely displaces it. And in this displacement, emotions become ghosts, invisible, yet exerting absolute influence. Elsa believes she is preventing chaos, but she is only cultivating an internal labyrinth where each step echoes what has been banned. This is the paradox of repression. Hiding a feeling is the surest way to strengthen it. Observing Elsa, I see that her withdrawal is not an act of choice, but of survival. A child who fears her own intensity builds a refuge where she can vanish from the gaze of others, convinced that her emotions are a wandering danger. Many of my patients lived exactly like this, blocking access to their own effect and believing they had achieved control. But the unconscious respects no locks. It works in silence, rearranging desires, fears, and memories until they find a path to return. Elsa's locked door does not stop anything. It only concentrates the storm already forming inside her. In the quiet of her room, Elsa reenacts the universal drama of repression, turning emotion into a fugitive. In my consulting room, I identified this pattern countless times. The attempt to expel a feeling from the field of awareness, forcing it into a territory where it supposedly causes no harm. But emotion does not accept exile. It returns disguised, transformed, intensified. She believes her power settles in isolation, when in truth it becomes sharper and more unpredictable. The room thus becomes a chamber of accumulated psychic energy, ready to rupture at the slightest fissure. When an emotion is confined, it loses its language, but never its force. In Elsa, I see someone who tries to hide not only her power, but the origin of that power, a raw, unintegrated affect she never learned to name. Repression turns feelings into underground noise, and the locked room becomes the container for that noise. A place where nothing disappears, it merely reorganizes. Each day she spends inside deepens the distance between who she is and who she believes she must be. And that distance is precisely the suffering produced by repression. Her solitude appears to me as a psychic phenomenon, a defense against the risk of feeling. Many imagine that locking themselves away is a solution, but it is merely the first act of a greater conflict. The unconscious continues to operate, insistent, shaping what has been repressed until it forces its return. In Elsa, that return is always explosive, for she never integrates what she fears, she only attempts to contain it, and what is not integrated eventually demands space. Repression is never calm. It is the prelude to a storm. Her room is a precise metaphor for the sealed unconscious, a space no one enters, yet one that governs everything. She imagines herself safe within it, but in truth, she is living inside her own shadow. In my analyses, I learned that whatever the subject tries to hide becomes the true center of their psychic life. Elsa believes she controls the danger by remaining isolated, but the danger begins to control her. The room becomes both fortress and prison, protection and sentence, a duality inherent to repression. And so, while she remains locked away, the affect grows, circles, intensifies. Repressed emotion does not dissolve over time. It takes root. Every minute in the room deepens the divide between her calm exterior and the inner turbulence waiting for release. The unconscious always finds a passage. For Elsa, that passage will appear the moment her psychic energy outgrows the symbolic door that attempts to contain it. And when that moment arrives, it will not be the world confronting her emotion. It will be Elsa confronting herself. When I hear the command, conceal, don't feel, I recognize the birth of a particular kind of psychic tyrant, the rigid superego. Such an instruction is not merely a rule, it is the installation of an inner judge who never sleeps. In Elsa, this command becomes a law carved into the unconscious, shaping her every gesture as if she were under constant surveillance from within. A child who learns that feeling is wrong grows into an adult who polices herself with merciless precision. This is how a superego becomes tyrannical, not through cruelty from others, but through the cruelty one internalizes as necessary for survival. In my analyses, I often found that prohibitions given in childhood echo with disproportionate force in the psyche. They mutate into absolute truths that the child carries long after the external authority has vanished. For Elsa, the instruction to hide her emotions crystallizes into a moral obligation, an unyielding code she must obey at any cost. She becomes both the frightened child and the severe guardian who punishes that child for every slip. This dynamic is the essence of a rigid superego. The voice that insists perfection is the only path to safety. As I examine her behavior, I see that the superego created by such a command is not simply moral, it is punitive. It does not guide, it threatens. Elsa's mind becomes a battleground where every emotional impulse is interrogated, judged, and ultimately condemned. The voice in her head does not say, "You must learn control." It says, "If you feel, you will destroy everything." This transforms emotion from a natural expression of life into a feared transgression. And in that shift, the superego becomes a tyrant ruling through terror. This internal authority operates with the cold logic of fear. Elsa is convinced that she must hide every trace of affect, as though emotion itself were a dangerous substance leaking from her hands. Children who internalize such commands often grow into adults who believe they must constantly monitor their inner world. They do not experience feelings, they supervise them. In Elsa, this vigilance is absolute. She watches herself more intensely than any external observer ever could. The superego is no longer an internal guide, it is a warden. In my work, I have often warned that a superego formed under fear becomes rigid, inflexible, and relentless. It creates not discipline, but self-persecution. Elsa's entire identity becomes structured around the prohibition to feel. Every impulse toward connection, expression, or vulnerability triggers an internal alarm. She reprimands herself instantly, as though emotion were a crime. This is what happens when the superego absorbs the terror of childhood. It enforces repression as moral duty and punishes any deviation with overwhelming guilt. The result is paradoxical. By trying to prevent harm, Elsa harms herself through constant self-surveillance. The order "conceal, don't feel" does not produce emotional control. It produces emotional paralysis. She learns to fear not only her power, but her very nature. And this fear feeds the superego, making it stronger, sharper, more intrusive. The tyrant grows each time she obeys it, and with every obedience, she loses a little more of her spontaneity, her authenticity, her ability to live without dread. What fascinates me is how such a simple command becomes an entire psychic architecture. A phrase becomes a principle becomes a prison. Elsa internalizes the prohibition so deeply that she believes it originates from herself. This is how the superego disguises its voice. It speaks as though it were the individual's own reasoning. She does not think, "They told me not to feel." She thinks, "I must not feel." This illusion is the final triumph of the rigid superego, when the subject no longer recognizes the authority as external. And thus, Elsa lives in a state of perpetual moral tension. She is both the creator and the victim of her own oppressive inner law. The tragedy is not merely that she hides her emotions, but that she believes hiding them makes her good, safe, worthy. She cannot see that the superego she obeys is built on fear rather than truth. Until she confronts this internal tyrant, she will continue to treat her feelings as enemies instead of companions. And when a person wages war against their own effect, the battlefield is always their own heart. When I observe Elsa's ice, I do not see merely a supernatural force. I see the perfect metaphor for emotional stasis. Ice is water that has lost its flow, a feeling that has been immobilized. In my work, I have encountered countless patients whose emotions did not disappear, but merely hardened beneath the surface. Elsa's power behaves exactly like that. It crystallizes the feelings she has forbidden herself to feel. Her frost is not an accident. It is the manifestation of every emotion she refused to allow, now taking physical form. Repression does not eliminate affect. It hides it. It presses it down into the unconscious, where it waits, building pressure like steam trapped beneath a frozen lake. When Elsa loses control, when the ice bursts outward in sudden violence, it is not the beginning of a crisis, but the end of one. These explosions are failures of repression, moments when the sealed chamber within her psyche can no longer hold the accumulating force of unexpressed emotion. The ice erupts because feeling demands expression, even when the conscious mind forbids it. In Elsa's case, every surge of power corresponds to an internal conflict reaching its breaking point. She tries desperately to contain herself, to maintain the illusion of calm, yet the very effort to suppress her emotions increases their intensity. This is a paradox I have often noted. The more fiercely one tries to imprison affect, the stronger and more disruptive it becomes. Her ice does not appear when she feels too much. It appears when she has tried too hard not to feel. The freeze is, therefore, not a power outage, but an overflow. The nature of her ice is particularly revealing. It spreads rapidly, without direction, without intention. It does not grow like a plant, but erupts like a symptom. And that is precisely what it is, a symptom. It expresses what Elsa cannot articulate. Each frozen surface is a message from the unconscious, declaring that something within her has reached saturation. She may believe the danger lies in her magic, but from my perspective, it lies in her refusal to acknowledge her internal world. The ice is simply that world, forcing its way into visibility. Ice, unlike fire, gives the illusion of calm. It is cold, still, silent. This mirrors Elsa's emotional strategy perfectly. She aims for silence, for neutrality, for absolute control, thinking that if she can appear calm, she will be safe. Yet beneath the frozen exterior, motion continues invisibly, pressure builds, cracks form, and eventually the entire structure shatters in a catastrophic release. Many individuals live this way, outwardly composed, inwardly boiling, unaware that their tranquility is merely repression in crystalline form. When she isolates herself and surrounds her body with ice, she is not defending others. She is defending herself from the terror of her own emotions. The ice castle she creates is an architecture of avoidance. Its sharp edges, its glittering walls, its cold beauty, all reflect the seductive quality of repression. It promises safety, clarity, simplicity. But within that beauty is fragility. A single emotional tremor can cause the entire structure to collapse. This is the danger of frozen emotion. It is stable only as long as nothing touches it. What strikes me most is that Elsa's ice is at its most violent, precisely when she's at her most frightened. Fear is the catalyst that breaks repression open. Each spike of frost is a confession. I cannot hold this in any longer. The unconscious does not respect the commands of the superego. It demands expression. And when emotion is frozen, expression takes the form of rupture. Thus, the danger is never the power itself, but the accumulation that precedes its release. It is the pressure, not the explosion, that threatens to destroy her. In essence, Elsa's ice is the language of her repressed affect. It speaks in shards and storms, in fractals and fractures. If she had been allowed to express her emotions freely, her power might have flowed like water, adaptable, gentle, alive. But repression has transformed that flow into rigidity. To melt the ice is not to weaken her, it is to feel. And only through feeling can she reclaim mastery over a power that was never dangerous until it was forced into silence. When Elsa flees to the mountain, many see it as her moment of liberation. But from my perspective, it is a classic maneuver of the psyche attempting to escape its own turmoil. Flight, in the psychological sense, is not movement toward freedom, but movement away from conflict. In her ascent, I observe not courage, but avoidance. She distances herself from the relational world where her repressed emotions are constantly triggered. The solitude of the peak offers her relief, yes, but this relief is the narcotic of repression, momentary, deceptive, and destined to collapse as soon as reality demands engagement once more. Her declaration of independence, though celebrated, contains all the hallmarks of a defensive gesture. Patients who retreat from their inner pain often mistake withdrawal for transformation. Yet the psyche does not change through isolation, it calcifies. Elsa's triumphant demeanor masks a deeper truth. She has not confronted her fear, she has merely moved it to higher ground. The feelings she avoids do not weaken in her absence. On the contrary, they gather strength in the unconscious, waiting for the inevitable moment when solitude can no longer shield her from herself. The mountain itself is symbolic, elevated, remote, unreachable. It represents the place where repressed content is stored, far from the daily life of the ego. Elsa imagines she has risen above her fears, but in truth, she has simply built a physical metaphor for the emotional distance she has always maintained. Her ice palace is a crystallized fortress of denial, beautiful yet brittle, radiant yet hollow. It is the fantasy of an ego that believes it can outpace the unconscious through sheer isolation, unaware that what is avoided becomes more dominant, not less. Her proclamation of freedom, sung to the icy wind, reveals the paradox of repression. The moment one believes they are free is often the moment repression has tightened its grip. She feels weightless only because she has severed connection, not because she has found peace. In the therapeutic setting, such moments are fragile victories, celebrated by the conscious mind, but silently watched by the unconscious, which knows the flight cannot last. Her euphoria is real, but it is also the emotional high that accompanies avoidance, masking the unresolved conflict beneath. The visual splendor of the palace she constructs mirrors the internal architecture of her defenses. Every sharp edge, every luminous spire, every pristine surface speaks of a mind striving for absolute control. The palace is not an expression of freedom, it is the aesthetic form of repression perfected. Symmetry replaces chaos, cold replaces feeling, height replaces intimacy. Yet in this magnificent structure, there is no space for warmth, for vulnerability, for the fluidity of human emotion. True liberation requires these elements. Repression, however, rejects them entirely. What she calls letting go is, in truth, a deeper entrenchment in her psychic defenses. She mistakes the absence of others for the absence of fear. Alone, she feels powerful precisely because no one is present to evoke the emotions she cannot bear to confront. But power that exists only in isolation is fragile. It is an illusion sustained by the absence of triggers, not by the integration of the self. In the heights of her solitude, Elsa does not find the true self. She finds only the self that remains when feeling has been forced into exile. The most striking element of her retreat is that she believes she is finally expressing herself. Yet what she expresses is not emotion, but defense. Her ice flows freely only because her feelings do not. The palace grows effortlessly while her inner world remains frozen. This is the great tragedy of repression. It allows the individual to create, to function, even to thrive outwardly, while the core of the psyche remains locked away. Elsa's productivity in solitude is not evidence of healing. It is evidence of how effectively she has walled off her pain. Thus, her escape to the mountain is not liberation, but suspension. She has paused the struggle between her conscious fears and her repressed emotions, but she has not resolved it. The unconscious does not remain silent simply because she has climbed beyond the reach of others. It waits, and when the outside world inevitably intrudes, as it always does, her carefully constructed illusion of freedom will fracture. True liberation will come only when she allows herself to feel, not when she runs from feeling into the cold comfort of isolation. When I examine Anna's presence in Elsa's psyche, I see the return of a feeling that was never truly extinguished, only buried beneath layers of fear and defensive rigidity. Repression may freeze emotion, but it cannot kill it. Anna is the embodiment of the affection Elsa has denied herself, the personification of everything she has pushed into the unconscious. When Anna steps back into Elsa's life, she is not simply a sister calling out to her. She is the repressed affect knocking at the door, insisting on being acknowledged. In every interaction between them, I observe the unconscious demanding its rightful place in the psychic structure, no longer content to remain locked away in the cold chamber Elsa created. What fascinates me is how Anna persists even when Elsa withdraws. This persistence mirrors the nature of repressed emotions. They do not vanish when ignored, nor do they weaken with distance. They insist, they return, they reappear in dreams, symptoms, impulses, and relationships. Anna, warm, impulsive, loving, serves as the external expression of an internal truth Elsa cannot escape. It is not that Anna refuses to give up, it is that affection refuses to die. Each time Anna reaches for Elsa, the unconscious strains against the ice walls that contain it, revealing how desperately Elsa's psyche longs for connection despite her conscious mind's terror. In many individuals who repress emotion, the path back to feeling comes not through introspection alone, but through the presence of another person who evokes safety. Anna serves precisely this function. She acts as a bridge between Elsa's isolated ego and her frozen affect. When Elsa sees her sister's unwavering loyalty, her internal defenses begin to tremble. The ice that once shielded her from emotional danger now cracks under the weight of shared humanity. In my view, this is the moment when repression begins to thaw. Not through force, but through warmth, a warmth Elsa has not allowed herself to experience for years. Anna's love destabilizes the entire defensive architecture Elsa constructed in her solitude. At first, this destabilization appears dangerous. Panic, loss of control, a surge of icy symptoms. But this is the natural consequence of re-engaging with buried affect. When a patient first reconnects with repressed emotion, it surfaces chaotically, often frighteningly, as if the psychic system does not yet remember how to hold it. Elsa's powers spiral not because Anna endangers her, but because emotion is returning to a system unprepared to feel. It is the turbulence of thawing, the chaos of a river breaking free after years beneath ice. The pivotal moment arrives when Anna offers herself not as a demand, but as a presence, steadfast, gentle, and unafraid. This is crucial. Many who repress their feelings do so because they believe those feelings are harmful. But Anna demonstrates the opposite, that affection, even in its most vulnerable form, is not a threat, but a remedy. When Elsa witnesses her sister's sacrifice, the fundamental belief sustaining her repression collapses. She sees that love does not destroy, it protects. And in that realization, her internal world begins to reconfigure itself around feeling rather than fear. The dissolution of Elsa's repression is not a magical act, but a psychological one. The moment she embraces Anna, her ice softens because the emotional meaning that maintained it has dissolved. Repression loses its purpose when the individual no longer perceives emotion as dangerous. In Elsa's embrace, I observe the reintegration of her psyche. Affect, once severed, returns to its rightful place in consciousness. Her powers change, not because they are different, but because she is. Expression replaces suppression, connection replaces isolation, flow replaces rigidity. In therapeutic terms, Anna functions as a corrective emotional experience. She provides the safety Elsa lacked, the acceptance she feared she would never receive, and the unconditional bond needed to dismantle the harsh superego that had ruled her. Through Anna, Elsa learns what repression had prevented her from discovering, that emotion is not a threat to control, but a necessary condition for psychological integrity. Love, in this sense, is not mere sentiment. It is the psychodynamic force that restores Elsa's capacity to feel without fracturing. Ultimately, Anna represents the return of Elsa's humanity. Her presence reminds Elsa of the self she silenced, the warmth she denied, the bonds she severed to survive her fear. When Elsa finally allows herself to feel in her sister's presence, the ice that has haunted her for years melts, not because it was defeated, but because it is no longer needed. Repression dissolves when emotion finds a home. And in Anna's love, Elsa's frozen inner world finally thaws, revealing the truth I have witnessed in many patients. The heart, once reopened, can reclaim everything fear once stole.